Who doesn't love a good super group of such? Now, this is the one thing that I love about progressive rock, especially within our day and age. We did this a lot in the 70s where band members would just kind of come together from different groups and just see what happens, and this is what we find here. So yeah, let's dive into this new, well, not really new one. Let's just dive into the next one. 11th Hour by Novena, and I really hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Novena? I think that's how you pronounce it. Novena. Well, that's what I'm going to stick to, and if I'm wrong, you guys will definitely let me know. This is, like I said, in some ways a supergroup of such. This band has members from Haken, being Ross Jennings on that one, as well as Slice the Cake, and then No Sins Evade His Gaze, and was it Bleeding Oath? I think it's Bleeding Oath, because there's no, that's an I. So yeah, a lot of different personalities on here. And the one thing that really stood out for me, because there's a lot of different personalities from bands that are relatively similar, like a lot of these are from progressive metal bands from the 2010s. They still feel very unified, but I also feel like they're trying to emulate the different bands from the 2010s. The biggest obvious items from that are like Haken, obviously with Ross being on there, but also things like early Opeth are found on here, and Between the Buried and Me is definitely found on here, and I'm going to be touching upon that a little bit more. Overall, I do want to set kind of a little bit of a groundwork here. Overall, this was still an enjoyable album. This was still a fun progressive metal album. I did enjoy myself while I was in it, but at no point did I really ever feel like this was the next groundbreaking progressive rock and progressive metal outfit. At no point did I really feel like this was a masterpiece or anything to really write home about. There were moments within the songs, and the more time that I spent in the album, the more I actually got out of it as well. Now, this was a classic case of the first couple of listens that I had, I wasn't excited about it. I didn't quite connect with it all that much. I kept seeing the flaws that were in it. But the more that I listened to it, and the more that I actually sat down with this album, the more I got out of it. The more I really started to enjoy my time with it. And I feel like this is the type of album that's going to be a grower. I feel like I'm really going to enjoy this album probably in the spring and summer of this year. But there are still some of those flaws and some of those aspects of this album that I'm like, ooh, I don't know about that kind of coming up. And so I want to get to some of those first. And I think the best way to do that is kind of talk about some of the songs that have those aspects. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the biggest aspect of this album that I'm not a big fan of are those moments where I could tell they're emulating other bands, whether those bands be bands that they were in previously or bands that they're trying to emulate. One of the biggest contenders of this is Lucidity, the middle track of this album. It feels very much like Visions from Haken. Not only the title track, but the overall album itself. In fact, that it has the same drive, that same dun 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 dun. Like, it's got that same drive, it's got the same root, and the same can be said about the last track of Prison Walls. Feels very much like Crystallized, again from Haken. And Prison Walls opens up very much like Between the Buried and Me's The Great Misdirect. There's a lot of moments in that beginning portion of Prison Walls that has that same kind of drive, that same kind of feeling that Between the Buried and Me utilized within The Great Misdirect. So those are like the biggest grievances that I have with this album. Outside of the fact that, again, now I'm starting to get into it, there are some moments that are really starting to stand out, but for the first 3, maybe even 4 listens that I had with this album, I didn't feel all that excitement about it. Now, I'd heard of Slice the Cake, but I've never actually listened to them, and I'd never heard of No Sins Evade His Gaze, as well as Bleeding Oath. I'm just going to keep calling it Bleeding Oath, even though I know it's not. And so I didn't really know what the personalities were going to feel like with that aspect to it. Now, I have since gone through and listened to Slice the Cake, especially with their the Odyssey double album that they put out, Odyssey to the West and Galaxy to the Gallows. Now, I kind of made the mistake of listening to Odyssey to the Gallows first, and did this all come to pass? Wow. That was a trip. That was a major trip. And then I did subsequently go to Odyssey to the West, and I honestly didn't Like, it was fine. To my ears, it was just generic progressive metal. I actually really enjoyed what they were doing with Odyssey of the Gallows a little bit more. And it does kind of showcase what was going on with Novena's approach to this. Because one of the things that I don't know if I really appreciated on this album was a lot of the spoken word aspect and a lot of that narrative flow. There were, and I don't use this term lightly, especially when I'm dealing with progressive rock, because it does come inherently with the genre, but pretentious was kind of felt a little bit on this, especially near the end point with the final track of Prison Walls. And there was a few points where I'm like, ooh, they might be stepping a little too close to, I don't know about that. But again, that's where Slice of Cake came in. Like, that was the mythos and styles that we had with that particular band. Now that I've gotten my hand on it, I do appreciate at least the structure of this album. The songs bleed into one another very, very well. There are some clear endpoints and starting points on this to make it more of a digestible chunk. I like how the first 5 tracks, the first 2 opening tracks of 2258 and 2259 being The Time, Sundance, Disconnected, and Sail Away. These tracks kind of are the opening, it's the first face of this album, because I see this as being like a three-sided album in that sense. And I enjoy kind of the ebb and flows. I like how Disconnected is a little bit of a touchstone after 2259 and Sundance, being a very big, bombastic romp. And then Disconnected is a little bit more of a subdued until we get to the midpoint. And I like how tangible this track is. It isn't quite all over the place. And now Sail Away is definitely that mellow point to kind of just usher us out until we get into Lucidity. Now, we do get into my 2 favorite tracks of, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, Corazon and Indestructible. I love how Carranza has this Latinx feel to it, how it's got this almost Spanish flair to it. I'm not quite sure what language the individual is speaking in this track. I think it might be Spanish, but it could be another one. My ears aren't that trained, but I love how different this feels. I love how fun this track feels, which then goes into Indestructible. And again, it has that same kind of fun aspect. Like, this has that drive that I'm really taken towards, which then bleeds us into the final 2 tracks of The Tyrant and Prison Walls. And these are the 2 longest tracks of, 10.5 minutes and 15 minutes. They're fine, and there are some moments on this that really get me excited, but there are also a lot of moments on this that I'm like, I don't know about this at all. They definitely wander the landscape, and we get into the Prison Walls, and we get into that spoken word aspect where he keeps repeating, it's nobody's fault, the damage is done. It reminded me of bands like Earthside and Native Construct, especially Native Construct, where I felt like there's just all this angst going on, and I was kind of like, guys, are we really still here where there's this much angst going on? Like, this is very early 2000s of the new metal kind of angst, and I just don't know if it's well placed here. I can see teenagers really digging this if they haven't heard this style of music before, and being like, yeah, it gets it. It's nobody's fault, but there's still damage done, and I'm still lamenting, and I'm still in my feelings. And there's definitely a market for that. Maybe I've just outgrown that. Overall, and kind of tying this all up, overall, the more time that I've been spending with this album, the more I'm seeing what I like about it, as well as those items that I don't. Corazon and Indestructible, as well as Disconnected. I'm loving these tracks. I'm really finding the groove of these tracks. I'm really finding what I'm coming back to this album for, but I'm also finding things that I don't like about this album as well. Overall, this is a really, really interesting album. I'm kind of wavering between, I'm not going to remember this album as well as a stream, but in the end, I'm going to split the difference and definitely say that there's enough material on this album to at least give it a stream. This is one that I would still go out and see, especially if you're a progressive metaler, if you want some of that more music from bands that you really, really like, this is going to, satisfy you in that sense, for sure. But in my mind, don't come here expecting something great game changing. Don't expect something that's breaking the mold. Like, this is definitely solidifying the mold, if anything else. And yeah, that's really all I have to say about Novenas, their latest album of the 11th hour. I kind of actually enjoy their EP of the Second Genesis a little bit more. I think there was just a little bit more to kind of dig your teeth into. Or Secondary Genesis. That's it, not Second Genesis. Maybe it's just because it was shorter. Who knows? So that's about it for 11th Hour. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know of your own thoughts about this album by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.